Hey guys, it's Leland Baptist, and today I'm gonna give you the key factors that you need to have for your buyer's agreement. Now here's the thing. When you're wholesaling real estate, typically what you're gonna use is an assignment agreement. But I'm not gonna talk about an assignment agreement. Instead, today, I'm talking about the key factors for the buyer's agreement. The buyer's agreement when we're wholesaling is used with the buyer primarily because you are going to earn or make, let's put it that way, you're gonna get a wholesale fee or an assignment fee. Well, let me back up. You're not gonna get an assignment fee. What you're gonna get is you're basically going to get proceeds. You're gonna double close on this property. That's what's actually happening. And so when we're using this buyer's agreement, it is with the intent that you are going to double close and that you're going to get maybe a payday that is $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. Now here's the thing, assignment agreements are normally used when you're okay with the buyer knowing how much you're gonna make off the deal. When we're double closing, we are basically making a veil between the seller and the buyer, okay? And that veil is basically you. It's your company or it's your name between the seller and the buyer. Typically, when we're doing an assignment, either the seller and or the buyer is able to see how much your assignment fee is. So the agreement that we're talking about today is the buyer agreement, because let's say you're gonna get more than $10,000 for the deal, and for whatever reason, your particular buyer on the other end is greedy McGreedy, okay? And so he or she is like, oh, you're getting $10,000? I could at least negotiate another $5,000, right? People think like that. It's crazy. So anyway, here's the deal. Here are the key factors. The number one factor that you need to have in this agreement is that the earnest money is non-refundable. I know what you're thinking, you're like, Leland, why do I want the earnest money non-refundable on the buyer's end, but I want a time frame to make my earnest money refundable on the seller's end? Here's the reason. The money on the seller's end is your earnest money. The money on the buyer's end is the buyer's earnest money. And keep in mind that your initial agreement that you have with the seller, you have a time frame. You have to basically honor that time frame and have that property sold within, let's say, that 2-week or that 4-week window, right? That 30 days, quote unquote. A lot of times what will happen is that you may have mom and pop investors, buyers, who will say, hey, I'll buy that property. And what they may or may not do is they have their own timeline. So you have already told the seller you have to close the deal by the 30th, but this new buyer comes in, on the 12th day of the month, and they say, yeah, I can close it by the 30th, right? From my experience, what tends to happen is for buyers who are not fully capable of closing the deal immediately, they will, quote unquote, drag their feet, or the closing date will be longer than the initial 12 days, okay? When that happens, earnest money becomes a lot more important. And what you have to do ahead of time is you have to have in writing on the initial agreement that you guys sign that the earnest money is non-refundable. Because what can happen is if the buyer is dragging the closing date further out than what you had initially agreed to with the seller, you could actually lose the deal with the seller, and the seller technically does have the right to pursue your earnest money. So a good way to protect yourself, even in the worst case scenario of that happening, is that you want to make sure that the buyer has their earnest money at the title company or at the attorney's office, and that their earnest money is non-refundable, therefore it will always be forfeited to you. So in the event that you had to forfeit money to the seller for the closing date taking longer than what it was supposed to be, you are also able to still gain money from the buyer's agreement that you had initially. This only works if you put it in the initial agreement. I'm telling you guys, I've done it where I did not have that initial agreement with the buyer about the earnest money, and then I tried to come back a week or two weeks later because I knew that my agreement with the seller was expiring, and I tried to come back and convince the buyer to sign an addendum to make their earnest money non-refundable, and guess what? It didn't happen because they weren't obligated to do that. That wasn't a requirement based on the initial agreement. There are so many key factors that you must have in the initial agreement that is meant to protect you. You as the intermediary, you as the wholesaler, you as the middleman, you need to protect yourself on the seller side and protect yourself on the buyer side. So that is why the number one factor there is actually going to be the earnest money. Here's a second factor that you got to have for your buyer's agreement. Make sure that in the writing of your buyer's agreement, your agreement is not assignable. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, Leland, How is it that my agreement is not assignable with the buyer, but it is assignable with the seller? Here's why. I have been in multiple transactions, and some of those transactions have been where I thought or believed that Bob was the end buyer. A week goes into the transaction, and come to find out, Bob is assigning it to John. John is then assigning it to Robbie, and Robbie is assigning it to Martha. So where initially Bob was, quote unquote, trying to negotiate me, now we have 5 or 6 other people who are involved in the transaction, and it also makes things longer than was necessary. All right. So hope that makes sense, and I'll talk to you soon.